Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone. Excited to bring you the final installment of the Establish the Edge projection special with Ben Gretch. Want to make sure to give a special thank you to Gretch for grinding out these projections and doing these podcasts with me these last few weeks. And it's something we've received a lot of positive feedback on. So really appreciate all the support out there. Also want to give a shout out to Jack Miller, Mark Dankenbring at Establish the Run, who have done a ton of work to help me with the Establish the Run projection side of things. And if you haven't listened to the previous episodes, make sure you go back and check those out. There's going to be 8 total. This is number 8. We're going to wrap things up with the NFC West. And yeah, Ben, excited to do this pod series with you every year, but also excited to finish every year.
Yeah, man, it's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun. I feel certainly honored to get the chance to do it with you and chat through it with you. Appreciate having me on. Appreciate the whole team at ETR. And then, yeah, like you said, we get a lot of great feedback on this. Definitely want to take a minute to shout out everybody who listens to all these. There's obviously a lot of content in these, but it's cool to see how positive the feedback is. For a lot of people, it's sort of like their entry back into fantasy football for the summer if they haven't been grinding best ball all off season. I know for me, it's like, yeah, now we're in crunch time. Like as soon as I do these pods with you these last couple of years, it's like I'm ready to go. It's a countdown to week 1 now.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's fun to put this stuff into action, and let's go to San Francisco and start putting this stuff into action. And I know for us, San Francisco is always one of the trickiest teams each year because their play calling, we've each got them below 63 plays per game, which is below average. We've each got them right around 55, 56% called pass rate, which is below average. And on paper, not super exciting, but they're efficient year in and year out. And that makes it somewhat difficult, to marry the efficiency and the volume. Something I hit on in the last episode is sometimes you have a tendency to regress the efficiency and then trust the volume. And I know with San Francisco, especially with the addition of CMC, they're a struggle where you can kind of visualize the upside on a lot of the individual players. But then when you're trying to do the math to make it work, it can get tough. So I'm excited to talk this through with you. But as I noted, we're pretty in line with the play calling. We're both expecting Purdy to be the primary starter. We baked in a little bit more risk on just him not being ready week 1. But so far, the signs are pretty good for Purdy. He's actually someone that I wanted to target a lot early in the offseason where I think people were overly discount. Super early in the offseason, I was worried he wasn't going to be ready with the arm stuff. But as that news got more positive, I was like, I think, if he's going at the very end of drafts, people are discounting the chances that maybe he's actually good. Super small sample, not a great prospect, but he was awesome in his starts last year. And Shanahan just has a history of kind of getting quarterback efficiency out of anyone. But I did kind of struggle to marry that with, I wasn't super high on the pass catcher. So how do you feel about Purdy?
Yeah, I mean, I think you put that well. The only reason I was the same way all off season. The only reason I projected only Purdy is like, it's just, it's more work, frankly, to do the whole other projection, similar to the Colts, where I kind of think Minshew might play a little bit this year, but it's like you have to redo the whole projection if Minshew's in there. Same thing here. Like you have to, if Trey Lance starts, everything changes for the the pass volume for everything, and that is an important thing to consider. But it does look, and it's favorable for the skill position guys. It does look like it's going to be Purdy pretty early in the season, if not week 1, and for the majority of the year that they're pretty comfortable with him, and that means fewer quarterback runs, especially, and a lot more of the short passing and the yak creation and the efficiency. And like you said, I mean, Shanahan's offenses can create efficient passers out of basically anyone, it seems. And so you have to feel like Purdy late is a reasonable bet. This is the kind of the Death Star of weaponry. I mean, the big new trend in the NFL has been sort of positionless stuff. One of the things we talked about, I know going back to like the Giants, they went and got Darren Waller. Okay, now they can be in 12 personnel, have 2 tight ends in the set, and they can either line up in a heavy package and run, or after they break the huddle, split Waller out. I think that's a big reason they brought him in. Daboll wants to use him creatively. The Niners do this more than anyone. McCaffrey last year, after they brought him in, was splitting out wide and running slants on the same play that Debo's in the backfield. So you have a wide receiver who can get back there and be a running back. You have a running back who can be an elite slot receiver, basically. I mean, they'll use McCaffrey as a weapon. So that, positionless element, at least to those two guys, but those two guys are so versatile that it kind of can shift around everyone else. Everyone else can bump like a little bit, but those guys can play basically anywhere on the field. It's a really fascinating team to project out, but the efficiency is going to be there. Shanahan's going to do it intelligently. And the volume, not great, but like you talked about on some of the earlier podcasts as well, like the efficiency drives the low volume in some respects. These guys have really high yards per play, and that means their drives tend to be fewer plays. At the same time, they run the ball a decent amount and they keep the clock moving too, and that has an impact as well. So the volume thing is a concern.
Yeah. And I do, just kind of going through and seeing our projected pass attempts were off a little, even though we have similar play calling. I do think we had the scramble rate on San Francisco too high. So some of the volume stuff that we're concerned about will be like slightly reduced. And I just hope that I updated the player level stuff as we go through this. But going to CMC, we've each got him cracking 90 targets, just shy of 100 targets, which is a pretty, huge projection for a running back. And we've got him over 200 carries. I think he's, the RB1. Eckler, who we talked about on the last podcast, I think is both of ours RB2 right now. I prefer CMC, but it's, it's kind of close. And with CMC, just getting him in this offense in San Francisco, I think just increases the high value touches that we harp on, where he's going to get the workload in the passing game. Maybe he gets a little bit less volume in terms of pure carries over the course of the season than he's maybe had some years in the past. But that's kind of a decent trade-off for a team that's going to score more than other teams that he's played on. And you kind of reduce the injury risk a little bit along the way by having, just there were times for Carolina where he was like a 98% snap share player, which was just kind of crazy for a running back.
Yeah, I kind of like this more almost. It's like in terms of longevity, some of the injury concerns he had in Carolina. In this setup, you're talking about, he's not going to have maybe even 50% of the rushes overall because Debo's taking some, Elijah Mitchell's obviously taking some, and down the running back group, you're going to have Jordan Mason, and you're going to have these guys mixing in. Kyle Juszczyk is going to get some carries, but he's not needing all, like those are the low value touches as you were alluding to, like a higher percentage of his touches now become the high value touches. He still got a lot of looks in close in San Francisco, plenty of touchdown equity, liked using him even in the passing game and creatively, I think in the red zone, some smart play designs. I remember one where they had him sort of split out in the flat, and I remember writing about him stealing signals last year where I think it was still when Garoppolo was playing. I'm not entirely sure, but the quarterback extended the play a little bit, and CMC, they're at like the 8-yard line. CMC's in the flat. He takes off as the play gets extended, just like straight up the sideline toward the end zone. It's just one of those feel things where he takes off right at the moment when someone was stepping up to take away the flat. He gets behind that guy immediately. The quarterback threw it to him. It's an 8-yard touchdown. It's an easy play. But it's an easy play because CMC is an instinctual player, and he's a very good receiving and route runner and find space kind of player. He did a great job of finding space on that play, is what I'm trying to describe. And so those kinds of things they're gonna pan out for you in the red zone. And obviously, we're talking about this massive target projection. He's going to have plenty of receptions. Those are all the big touches for fantasy football, right? The receptions, the TDs. I do come out with McCaffrey slightly ahead of Eckler, but these are the two guys that are the high value touch kings this year. When you look at a projection, I have them for the top two receptions by a lot. I have like Jahmyr Gibbs is my third one, quite a ways behind. But then I also can't project Gibbs for nearly the touchdown potential of McCaffrey and Eckler. That combination that these two running backs have is really strong for their floor and their ceiling.
Yeah, well said. Let's go to the backup running back spot where Elijah Mitchell, I think, does have some value, but we've got a pretty different projection here. You've only got him with 106 carries. We have 154 carries. And it was, there were times last season, especially in games where San Francisco got ahead, where Elijah Mitchell in the second half would be used really heavily in the ground game would end up even like out carrying McCaffrey in some of those games. And then some of the games that were a bit tighter in terms of the score differential all the way through, you wouldn't see as much Elijah Mitchell. But I have been taking him in best ball just because I think that dynamic gives him some standalone value for a team that's going to score a decent bit of rushing touchdowns. I do think it's going to have some big leads over the second half. And then you also get the handcuff value on CMC in addition. I'm trying to figure out where your carries are. You've got, a few more CMC's way and then a few more Jordan Mason's way. I guess that kind of the combination of those two add up to our gap on Elijah Mitchell.
Yeah, and I'm kind of looking at that as well too, because I've been taking Mitchell as well, and I think he's a good play, especially in best ball, because as you're kind of describing, I mean, I think like plus script at some points there was games where they kind of leaned off McCaffrey in the second half and just let Mitchell go to work and get like 10 second half carries. I think you're going to see his touches consolidate some weeks, and that's obviously a positive for best ball. You get sort of usable weeks, and then the weeks when they're not usable, you're not just like, I mean, it doesn't matter in some respects if he gets 2 points or 6 points, right? But like, it seems like a profile where he could have some games where he has 2 points. But I do think your guys' numbers are a little bit closer to what I feel like he'll actually do. This is it feels like a mistake on my end, but I think he's really intriguing. One thing that I was a little concerned about in doing the projection was sort of how Kyle Juszczyk is. I mean, he's used so interestingly. He's essentially the tight end 2. The non-Kittle tight ends combined for 12 targets all year, because despite Kittle only playing 15 games. And so, like, I mean, they didn't even really mix in other tight ends the games when Kittle was active. But he also limits the non-CMC running back targets. I mean, you had a few for Jeff Wilson, which was basically before CMC showed up. But he had 13 on the year. But if you remove Jeff Wilson and look at the rest of the running backs, Elijah Mitchell he doesn't play a lot of games last year, but winds up with only 4 targets, 45 carries. And then you have like Tevin Coleman had 3, Tyrion Davis-Price had 2. Those guys combined for 46 more carries. I mean, that group had 9 targets and almost 100 carries. And so I ended up projecting Mitchell for a sort of a similar rate. And I think it's important that Mitchell gets up to around 150 carries is what I'm getting at. I think he's a better bet in half PPR. He's a rushing efficiency play described.
Yeah, I remember, he was getting a little bit of pass catching work when it was like the year prior when he took over a little bit, but last year certainly his role was the, grinder from ahead, the 2-down grinder from ahead, and CMC playing the clear all the pass down stuff. So that's a good point, and it is important how those line up. You need the carries to be there because we know the targets aren't going to be there. Going to the wide receivers, right now we feel pretty good. It's Purdy, as I said, kind of like adjusted our scramble rate a little bit, which is favorable for the targets here, but that does show you, it seems like Lance is kind of dead at this point. But if Trey Lance were to play, like, things could go really bad for the wide receivers, I guess. I just wanted to point that out because, one, I think they'd call more run plays to begin with, but also the called pass plays would turn into scrambles at a higher rate. And then, like, the targets start to drop off, I think, like, a lot more than you'd probably expect than when you actually do the math. But we've each got Deebo Samuel for around 115 targets, Ayuk for around 100 targets as the clear, top 2 wide receivers. We'll get to Kittle in a second when we do tight ends. I've been somewhat in on Deebo in that 3rd round when the wide receivers get pushed up so much. He's someone from a talent perspective that I don't mind betting on when you start getting into the riskier 3rd round wide receivers, like guys like Amari Cooper and whatnot. So I've taken him a decent bit. I haven't taken a ton of Ayuk as he's come up the board. I think he's, an okay bet. It's difficult to parse exactly what the target share allocation is going to be for San Francisco when all these guys are healthy, which is kind of a key component to all this and Ayuk's upside, because there were a lot of moving parts last year, and there will be moving parts again this year, but probably going to get more games than last year where the big 4 are all playing together between Deebo, Ayuk, CMC, and George Kittle.
Yeah, I mean, I think you put that all really well. It's almost it'd almost be easier if we were getting like negative camp reports about Ayuk, but we're getting these incredible camp reports. Tebow's out here saying, you can't cover him in a phone booth. He looks ready to take this next step to the top 5 overall wide receivers. And so, it gets you excited about Brandon Ayuk, who took a step forward last year after a down second season. When you look at like targets per out run, some of that stuff, a lot of times when you get in these constant or these passing games that have a lot of options, concentrated, but several. Not sometimes we refer to concentrated as like 2 main options, but like 4 options. You kind of find that the targets per out run obviously are going to come down because not everybody can run a target on every play. But you might find that 1 or 2 guys sort of slips more than others, where it's that guy's probably not on the other one's level. I guess the Bengals is the one that comes to mind. Tyler Boyd has fallen quite a bit the last couple of years when Chase and Higgins have been doing their thing together. And he's just probably not on the level of those guys. We didn't see that last year in San Francisco. Like Kittle, came down a little. Debo came down a little. Ayuk actually came back up from his sophomore year, but still not to like elite levels. McCaffrey comes down a little from what he had done earlier in his career. And it kind of just paints this picture of like, yeah, it's 4 really good players competing for targets, and not everyone can get to the levels they did when they were in weaker passing games. And so, I mean, individually, each of them looks really good, and there's not really a reason to be out on any of them or be like, yeah, this guy is more of an alpha than that guy. Debo, you mentioned, I'm willing to make the bet on Debo too. Weird year for him. His ADOT comes down from 2021. Big part of his 2021 breakout was that he was getting more downfield targets, more air yards overall. ADOT comes down, but also his efficiency falls. Catch percent comes down, which at a lower ADOT, his catch percent shouldn't be falling necessarily, and he's always going to have a weird distribution because a lot of his targets are coming right at the line of scrimmage. But his yards per target also way down. He's obviously a huge yak guy. I think he's a really reasonable one to bet on the efficiency to bounce back a little bit. And you like that, he's a guy they're going to use some on the ground. And so, like in any script, you feel like he can get worked into the game plan to some degree, short passes. The ideal for him would be to get some more of those downfield targets. But then if Ayuk is like a legit breakout player this year, that might be part of the reason that Debo wasn't really getting those. It's tricky. It's tricky when you start thinking about it from different depths too, because even at the shorter areas, you have Christian McCaffrey in those ranges now as well. I do have this projection really consolidated on those 4 guys. Jawan Jennings for about 50 targets, but the rest of it for me is like I don't see a lot of scenarios where the Niners are not throwing a really high percentage of these 4 guys. Even if one goes down, you still have 3 other ones, and I think they probably consolidate.
Yeah, and generally speaking, we really like these condensed offenses. It's a little easier when they're condensed and they're going to throw a lot, which is basically the whole reason we're having this conversation is that trying to offset the volume, they can be really efficient. They're going to be condensed, but like the market wants these types of players too. So it can be tricky. Ayuk's average target share in the games where Kittle and Debo played was just under 19% on this season. We've got him around 20%. We're projecting Debo for 23%. Honestly, we're matching basically the season-long target shares pretty closely to what they did last year. But the playoff games for Ayuk weren't ideal. 17% target share, 14%, and 6% target share for the 3 playoff weeks. For Ayuk in those games, Debo was at 30%, 24%, 33%. Kittle 7%, 17%, 22%. Small sample, but I am a little worried when they're all healthy that maybe Ayuk is left.
That's a good sample. I think that's an interesting point.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think where he's going is okay. I was probably too bearish on him, just maybe lagging behind again as we switch stuff from Lance to Purdy, just lagging behind some of the other team stuff, didn't adjust like as quickly as we should have. I think he's going in an okay spot, but he's
still not an easy click there. I haven't taken him a lot either, and I'm always drafting receivers in that range, but it's not. It's not easy to click there.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's no one at wide receiver, in my opinion, that's fantasy relevant behind Debo and Ayuk. We mentioned it's concentrated. You've even got more targets on Jennings than we do. We've got 37. You've got 51. Moving over to Kittle, you've got 98 targets. We've got 88. your stuff tends to run a little bit hotter. I should note too, you're a little bit higher on the efficiency overall on the wide receivers too, which does make a difference. And again, that's where it can be tricky. We don't know exactly what we're going to get out of Purdy. We do know historically, like these offenses have just worked and been really efficient passing, almost who's been back there. But with Kittle, the better in best ball tag, I don't think applies to a lot of people. It's overused, but for Kittle, I can definitely see where this spike week upside for him at tight end is kind of insane, relative to other tight ends. I mean, he's had some 35 plus point games out there. Maybe not quite 35 plus point in half PPR, but he's had some absolutely monster weeks, but he'll also put together a bunch of weeks where, he struggles to crack 20 yards receiving, just because they're not throwing a lot. They'll ask him to block. There's other guys to compete for targets. So he's really interesting to me where like I can really visualize the upside, but you can also see where it could be like a pretty pedestrian season just from a volume standpoint.
Definitely. I mean, I think you put that well. I have had a really hard time with Kittle because the last few years, because when you look at his profile, I mean, there's clear efficiency year in and year out. You're going to get that, but it's like from a season-long perspective, when you're doing a projection like this, like what is the ceiling? He's missed some time, but he hasn't had even 1,000-yard season since 2019. Like you go all the way back to 2018, his breakout year had 136 targets. And again, missed some time in the season since, but not been as much of a target, like big time target guy in the aggregate, right? When you look at his like full season numbers in the last couple of years. But like you said, I mean, it's more just that like some weeks he's not as prioritized. He's a great blocker. He might just have like a 2-target game. The next week he can, and for him, it might only take 6 targets. He's going to have 4 catches and 2 touchdowns. And I mean, at tight end, that's obviously very playable. It's going to be a top 3 week on the week probably. So, I mean, he's like a tricky one for me, and I think you're right. He's better in best ball for sure.
Yeah, I think our ADP adjusted ranks do have Kittle a little bit ahead of Pitts. I've generally been siding with Pitts over Kittle, but like, who do you have there? That's
where I would lean towards Pitts. I think ADP leans a little towards Kittle, if I'm not mistaken, right?
But it does. The ADP it's
a like great example.
Higher on Kittle.
9 spots higher on Kittle. It's a great example of what I was kind of trying to articulate there, where like Pitts is one I can tell myself this full season breakout story where he, is pretty reliable. Not every single week, obviously. There's some volatility, but the target share can be really large for Pitts. If he gets that sort of wide receiver role, et cetera, like he could be a 150 target player. I can see that. And I can be like, okay, he's this monster breakout. I don't feel like Kittle has that type of ceiling, but in any given week, he has as much ceiling as any tight end, like you were saying.
Yeah, really well put. That makes a lot of sense. Let's go over to Seattle. And man, both these West divisions that we finished with are fun to talk through. Seattle's another one. We've got them around 62.5 plays per game, roughly. Each have them at 61.5% called pass rate. The difficulty with Seattle for me is the combination of trusting Pete Carroll and Geno Smith. It worked really well last year. There were definitely some positive signs in terms of how Seattle called plays in general. Their pass rate over expectation was positive 1.5%, which I was honestly kind of shocked by. Would not have expected to see that coming into the year. Of course, would not have expected Geno Smith to complete nearly 70% of his passes coming into the year either. So that's a really good sign for Seattle. Does it hold up a second year? I'm not sure. A lot of people are really bullish on this offense. What they've done in terms of investing in skill players is another good sign. Drafting Jackson Smith and Jigba. They draft Zach Charbonnet. And yeah, I get the bullishness, but I find myself a little bit worried that Geno and Pete can support this many skill players. Geno is another one of those guys, though, like Russ and whatnot, where you're definitely taking him in situations where it makes sense for the stack. I don't really think he's a one-off type of play, which is just kind of how you're supposed to play fantasy with these non-elite rushing quarterbacks.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. to go back as well to he played a decent amount in 2021. I'm trying to get the exact number of dropbacks, but his completion percentage was
High.
really high that year as well. I mean, yeah, so he's had I mean, it surprised me to dig into this. Yeah, so he only had 112 dropbacks that year, but 68%, 69% completion percentages the last couple of years. TD rates have been strong both years. Yards per attempt. I mean, they're like identical. I think his TD rate's identical both years, 5.3%. His yards per attempt, 7.4, 7.5, like right there. And now, with that, like pretty efficient, and I like the completion percentage element. And people you see the film takes. I saw a tweet the other day that was talking about him being one of the most accurate downfield passers in the league last year. The film takes have been talking about his accuracy, not just in the numbers, but where his ball placement was, that he looks like a guy that, he didn't play for a lot of years, but has been putting the ball in really good spots and is playing, good quarterback and an accurate quarterback. And now he adds a potentially elite possession guy to the mix, this wide receiver 3 JSN that has this skill set that I think is exactly what helps that, it would improve that for a quarterback who needed to be more accurate or needed to raise his completion percentage and get the easy wins. I did the projection. I came out a little bit more interested in Geno. I hadn't really been taking him a lot, but I can see where, adding these new weapons and the efficiency that he's shown the last couple of years, there's definitely optimism that he can be like, Pete Carroll and the play calling might slow it down a little bit, but that he can be efficient enough to have some pretty impressive weeks at least. Another kind of maybe better and best ball guy, but might have some impressive efficiency spikes at individual weeks.
Yeah, no, that's a good call. Let's look at the running back situation because, as I mentioned, they brought in the rookie Charbonnet for, with some decent draft capital, with someone that a lot of people were excited to see where his landing spot would be, a guy that projects to potentially play an every down type of role. But then he lands in Seattle where they already invested a lot in Kenneth Walker. Walker showed to be a pretty big boom bust guy for them last season. I know for me, I've been drafting a lot of Walker as his price tags dipped into the 5th round, where you're just betting on these elite rushing, efficiency guys. I know historically we like guys who catch more passes. I think Walker is going to catch just enough passes to be fine. But if the offense is good and Geno supports it, and you mentioned kind of those outcomes, Ben, like Walker could really smash in terms of a really efficient season, a 5+ yards per carry season with a really high touchdown rate, can score from distance. So I'm still in on Walker, even though they drafted Charbs here as the RB2.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I think, Walker showed a good rushing profile last year, a little bit boom bust, but certainly explosive. Charbonnet, has a 3-down profile, had the good receiving in addition to pretty strong rushing numbers in college. It's at least mildly concerning to me that he transferred away from Michigan and, wasn't really able to make his mark there in a big way. And then winds up really making his name. And maybe I'm being a little bit biased here, but like in a Chip Kelly offense where, in the past we've seen running backs do incredibly well in Chip Kelly offenses, LaMichael James, Royce Freeman, put up these incredible college numbers and then not really perform as well at the NFL level. I'm at least mildly concerned about that. I do like Charbonnet. He was a fun guy to watch, but then you're also like, when you watch him, you're like, he's running through huge holes. So it is kind of interesting I'm at least mildly concerned, I would say. I still think he's a pretty solid prospect and a guy to be willing to take some shots on in drafts. But by comparison, I feel more comfortable with Kenneth Walker, who, interestingly enough, was also a transfer player in college. So I'm kind of, holding that against Charbonnet, but, they both were. But Walker showed enough last year, is sort of the incumbent already. Charbonnet has to make his mark. I kind of feel like he's slated for, Travis Homer left in the offseason, played a lot on passing downs. DJ Dallas has done some of that in the past. Charbonnet is easy to slot into those snaps. And so I do have him, it looks like we both have them very similar in targets, despite having a pretty big gap towards Walker in carries. So we have Charbonnet being, more of this, touch mix leaning towards receptions type of receiving back. but also getting, 100 plus carries. But I mean, I just feel like Walker still could catch as many balls and have a lot more rushing, upside and sort of just be the lead. Anyway, I'm with you. He's a dead zone back that I'm willing to take swings on.
Yeah, I think the talent's there, and the cost right now is like just overly shy and I don't even think Charbonnet's cost is like that bad. Like we have him RB32, his underdog ADP is RB32. This hasn't happened a lot, but when I've gotten a real good price tag on Walker, who seems to have like a lot of variance from room to room, when I've gotten a real good price tag on him and then Charb slips past ADP, I have taken them both together, kind of like the Aaron Jones, AJ Dillon thing we talked about in that episode, where they both probably have a role and they should be like 90% plus of the RB touches when they're both healthy, where I think on any given week, either of them could crack your lineup and, you get windows of contingent upside. Hopefully neither of them goes down for a long period of time if you're drafting both of them, but you do get some spike week upside if one goes down or the other. So I think it's an okay strategy to use both of those guys together in best ball.
For sure. I think that's fine.
Let's go
bet on the offense.
Yeah, let's go to wide receiver where it's really tough. Again, this is where I get the optimism on the offense, but like I get a little bit shy on some of these price tags. So DK Metcalf, just to set the stage here, his ADP right now is wide receiver 15. Tyler Lockett is wide receiver 33. Huge gap between those guys, despite them, once again, scoring pretty much the same in fantasy. And Jackson Smith and Jigba is wide receiver 32. I feel like Lockett and JSN's price tags have come down a little bit recently. I'll have to double check if that's just my personal perception or reality. But Metcalf's the guy I've had the toughest time getting early on. I've got him projected for 123 targets. You have 130. For Lockett, we have 101 targets. You have 107. For JSN, we have 93 targets. You have 107. We do have JSN ranked higher than Lockett due to some efficiency stuff and just ceiling upside for the rookie. I've been getting some JSN lately, which I'm excited about because early on in the offseason, like he was going in like round 5 and it was tough. Now he's slipped into round 6 and it's not too difficult to get him, which I'm excited to get some exposure there because he's the exact type of receiver you want to be in on. It just, how quickly does he cut into the target share and can Geno support 3 pass catchers in the first 6 rounds? That's the question with Metcalf. I'm really curious how you feel about Metcalf, Ben, where, he's a gam for sure, but he hasn't been like able to like super meaningfully separate from Lockett the past few years. And us projecting it and the market drafting still are giving him credit for being like the alpha wide receiver. I think he deserves some of that credit, but like how much credit do you give him there when, he hasn't really separated from Lockett too much the last few years?
Yeah, really tricky one as you laid out. What's kind of fascinating is Lockett continues to be this guy that is sort of breaking stats a little bit every year where, he's never had an elite like targets per out run, for example. I think his career has 21.2%. Last year it was 20.5. It's right in that same range as always. But he does it at a high ADOT and he's always efficient. Like his efficiency when you especially control for his ADOT and all these things. It seems capped, right? But like he's continued to do it every single year. His efficiency is on such an elite level that it makes his ceiling seem capped. So like when I'm thinking through the Lockett and JSN thing, I'm like, look, Lockett continues to be really good, and he also often gets ranked behind where he's finishing, and people make good points on that. But also, it's like until he shows this like next target earning gear, there's not really much more he can do but continue to be this otherworldly efficient. And it's also one of those things where it's like, I have a hard time betting on otherworldly efficiency for still probably a capped target number, right? So, and now JSN's in the mix, right? JSN's upside case is, okay, well, he's just immediately an elite player, right?
Yeah.
Or Shane Waldron came over from, the Rams last year, and they didn't really use as much 3 wide receiver sets as the Rams had in the past. But now they've gotten his new Cooper Kupp. They've gotten his slot plus player in JSN. And that's, I think one of the upside paths for JSN, where if you want to look at it from a projection standpoint, you can look at the offense and say, if he's in a Cooper Kupp type role, like that's going to be incredible. And then Metcalf is interesting because his targets per out run the last 2 years actually has been up. He's been able to elevate that up to like a 24%, 25%. But his yards per target has come down both the last 2 years relative to his first 2 years. So those are the two elements that go into yards per out run. His yards per out run, all things considered, has been pretty stable and solid and good. But it's interesting because he's gotten there different ways his first 2 years and his third and fourth years. The first 2 years, lower targets per out run, high efficiency per target. The last 2 years, it's like, well, some of these pass attempts weren't working, but we'll keep feeding it to him. I think it's a good thing for his floor to be like, yeah, like when the efficiency's not there, they keep throwing him the ball. They keep putting him up for this GAM profile. But you'd like to see if he can earn a lot of targets and spike the efficiency at the same time. He hasn't been as efficient as Lockett the last couple of years in terms of things like yards per target and touchdown rate. So it's tricky. When I look at the profiles in the way I'm describing, it does feel like there's more meat on the bone for Metcalf to put it all together one year and have this really elite season. But I don't really love his price the way you described it as well. And then Lockett and JSN both feel like viable picks right at the same spot. So that's always tricky too. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, the Metcalf Lockett gap to me makes more sense this year than like last year was like 30 spots of wide receiver ADP, not overall spots of like just positional spots. And that seemed too wide for me, especially when like they were both the clear 1-2. When you add JSN to the mix, I get why that gap's wider too, because like you would think he would cut in more. He'd be more of a risk to Lockett than to Metcalf for a lot of the reasons you said. So I get that. I think for me with Metcalf, it's hit on a lot of some of these running backs who have fallen like that 2-3 turn. I feel more comfortable with like Olave, Higgins, Devonta. Like I'll take those guys ahead of the running backs, but then I'm sort of leaning towards the Josh Jacobs, Breece Hall type 3rd round running backs before Metcalf. And I think Metcalf's more in the like Deebo Samuel, Keenan Allen kind of tier, which is an ADP about a half round behind where he's going right now. Which,
that's very well put for me as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And then as you said, Lockett and JSN right now seem fine at cost. I'm more bullish on JSN just because I want that like late season upside profile, but they seem fine at cost.
It's funny because in a projection, like Lockett's so efficient that you can't really justify like completely minimizing his efficiency. JSN's a rookie. No matter how bullish you are on him, it's hard to make his efficiency anywhere near where you're, looking at Lockett's where it's been. And then the only way to offset that would be if you were to project JSN to immediately out target him. So you look at like a base projection, like it's impossible to project JSN for more than Tyler Lockett. I wanted to, I tried. It's not possible.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I know we went through that struggle too. It's like, are we really going to give JSN a higher base target share than Lockett? And again, when you add in ceiling and stuff, we get JSN higher in ranks, but yeah, it is tough from a base projection standpoint. At tight end, Noah Fant, a little bit of a disappointing year from a volume perspective with Seattle, who seems to just want to use multiple tight ends. And now they're already heavily concentrated on wide receivers, and that's going to be even more so the case when you throw JSN into the mix. With that said, like Noah Fant to me is like a pretty talented tight end who's absolutely free. So he is one of the round 18 tight ends that I felt pretty good about clicking. The most nervous I feel about clicking him is that the market really just wants nothing to do with Noah Fant. I mean, he like goes undrafted in some drafts in best ball.
Yeah, last 3 years, solid targets per out run, or last 4 years, his whole career. I've mentioned a stat that I use in my projections, depth adjusted racer relative to his ADOT, his racer, his air conversion ratio would be higher because he has a lower ADOT, but it's even higher than you would expect when you control it every year. All 4 years, he's been very strong in terms of like where he comes in with like a yards per target relative to what you would expect based on his ADOT, which is a lower number, meaning he's adding yak. He's adding stuff, really high catch rates. I mean, he's he's good. Like you said, like everything about it's like he's a really interesting player in that his whole career, we could view it differently if he just landed on some different teams, because he has played 4 really good football seasons, but just can't get enough routes no matter where he goes. And like you said, it's Seattle wants to do the tight end by committee stuff. It's kind of interesting because Will Dissly's like the same. Like he's also really good in the depth adjusted racer every single year. They use him sort of sporadically, and Dissly's been efficient every season when they use him as well. And then even Colby Parkinson in the mixed in last year was efficient last year. I think he was like over 8 yards per target, which for a tight end is very strong. So they are doing something that works, but it's like it's annoying for a Noah Fant, for a Noah Fant truther to want to see more from him. It doesn't seem like we're going to get enough. We got 350 routes from him last year. You probably need him up around 500 plus to see that efficiency and that profile really manifest.
Yep, we've each got him projected for around 60 targets. Will Dissly for exactly 30 targets, so a 2-to-1 ratio there. Yeah, I feel like round 18 though, it's like we think he's good. He's going to be the lead tight end. It might not be spectacular, but I don't know. Maybe it breaks, right? And if it doesn't,
right,
you got a starting tight end sort of thing.
It could break right a couple different ways. Certainly, the other tight ends could get banged up. One of the big discussion points on this offense that we haven't hit on yet is that they used a lot of multi-tight end sets last year, so people are concerned about their 3 wide receiver usage. I think that the selection of Jackson Smith and Jigba obviously sort of tips their hand toward more 3 wide receiver usage. How much more is the question? But it's not like they're going to only do multi-tight end stuff. The way I did this projection was like, I think I basically didn't put very many targets at all to the wide receiver 4 and 5, like fewer than I would in any other projection, because I think when they get that third receiver on the field, it's going to be the 3 guys we think. And then when they're not having him on the field, it's like the extra player they're going to bring on is the additional tight ends. It's kind of like who's the 5th receiving option in their passing game rather than like the wide receiver 4. The 5th receiving option is probably the multi-tight end. The 6th receiving option is probably also the 3rd tight end before it's, D. Eskridge or somebody. Point being, if they had some injuries like with Dissly or with JSN or something, I mean, Fant can pretty easily, it feels like, get into a 3rd share, target share, because there's not really other wide receiver, competition necessarily. But I don't know. I mean, it should have been that way for him last year, I guess, is the better way to put it. Like he should have had over 350 routes last year, and it's hard to explain why he didn't.
Yeah. Let's go to the Rams. We've got them around 62 to 62.5 plays per game, around a 61 to 62% called pass rate. So we're pretty similar on the play calling. We have extremely similar lines on Matthew Stafford, just shy of 4,300 yards, 25 passing touchdowns, putting him around 270 full season fantasy points. And I've struggled with the Rams a lot for a few different reasons. In terms of the passing game, the O-line was a nightmare last year. This is a team again that I think we could see a similar implosion to what we saw last year, where if things start off poorly and guys are dinged, they could just kind of give up on the season more or less. So I've been trying to weigh that systemic risk with some growing optimism. I've seen from some sharp people in the industry around Stafford, around Cooper Kupp in particular. And then also when we get to Cam Akers, which we will in a second, there's a huge range of outcomes, it seems like, on Cam Akers, and we've really been just conservative and middled it. So just what are your high level thoughts on the Rams?
I think you put that really well. They could self-destruct, and I think that's a pretty big risk. It could also be that, the way that they self-destruct in 2022 was part of a Super Bowl hangover after a 21-game season, and McVay talking about potentially retiring in that offseason, and maybe they just realized last year we're going to pack in this year and turn it ahead to 2023, but that expecting that to happen again this year is maybe a little bit unfair, because I do think the 2021 year was a long year for these guys. They played a lot of football. And once Kupp goes down, especially last year, it really changes things. But yeah,
I had a tough time, building the roster with everything they did to go in for the Super Bowl.
Traded Jalen Ramsey. Yeah, their defense is falling apart a little bit. I think you're right. I think there's definitely risk with where they're at. keeping this afloat has been difficult. They don't have other receiving options. They're not really adding to the running back room, or I mean, they added Zach Evans in day 3, but they haven't had a lot of picks because of the trades they made to acquire, a lot of the talent that they did to make the Super Bowl run. So they're a tough one for sure.
Let's go to Akers. Wild ride for Cam Akers last year. Kind of why some people don't like the Best Ball Mania tournament structure, because he goes from, one of the worst picks to a guy you kind of needed in the playoffs, which was crazy. And just even from a real life perspective, we thought Akers was buried on this team. The team wanted to completely get rid of him. And then he finishes as the workhorse back. They put very little investment into the running back position this offseason. Can't really afford to where they are. So it sets up for, I've seen some comparisons to him as like this year's Josh Jacobs, a former kind of like early-ish draft pick at the running back position who sets up on this team that's like middle of the pack to get a lot of volume. And I definitely get that comparison. You've got for him for 240 carries. We've only got 187. Just because we're being wimps, we don't really know what to do here. I don't have any conviction on this. Do you have as much conviction as your carry?
I do.
Projection?
Yeah, Akers is a guy I've been really excited about all offseason, honestly. The Achilles injury, we know to be more of like an 18-month injury. He got back after a summer Achilles in 2021. He got back for the 2021 playoffs in early, January 2022, but it was like a 6-month timeline, and he clearly didn't look himself. And I think just because he got back, people expected him to look himself in week 1 of 2022. Because, hey, now you have a whole offseason. You made it back for the playoffs last year, but he still was only at about 12 months. And from what I understand, I'm not great with the medical stuff, but from what I understand, the Achilles is more of an 18-month recovery. And so I was pretty concerned about Akers last year and felt like Mr. Smarty Pants all year. And then what you're talking about late in the year, I mean, when we got closer to that 18-month window, final 6 games, we see a big snap increase to like a more of a workhorse role for him. He averages over 100 total yards. He rushes for 100 plus in each of the final 3, 6 touchdowns in 6 games to close the season. Looks like a really good version of himself, and we saw him be really good prior to the Achilles. I'm like, okay, we just had too high of expectations on his rehab, but the way he closed the year is pretty optimistic now. You're not completely done with the Achilles. I know it's limited in terms of the success stories, but Deontay Foreman's a really good example where it took a couple of years. That guy was a really interesting prospect, tore his Achilles with the Texans, popped back up a couple years later with the Panthers. Now he's with the Bears, but we like this guy, and he's a Achilles bounce back candidate where he showed some rushing efficiency after multiple years of recovery. I mean, it wouldn't be crazy to me that Akers comes back around, and then it is a spot to like for a running back. They're thin, like you said. In McVay's tenure, running backs have accounted for a really high percentage of their touchdowns. They really feature the back in close. And then he just likes to also lean on a committee back. Now, the one concern is they haven't really thrown to the running backs much. No more than 76 total running back targets for the last 4 years. Amounts to a 12.5% market share maximum over the last 4 years for the whole position. So that's definitely light. Like we were just talking about Christian McCaffrey, we're projecting for him by himself for like 17, 18, maybe even close to 20%. You can go back to early Sean McVay. Todd Gurley had some 80 target seasons, but that number fell to 49 his final season. And with the rise of like Cooper Kupp and the way this offense runs now, a lot of short targets to Tyler Higbee, they have not thrown to the backs as much. So I do think there's a little bit of a limit, upside limitation there. And he's obviously a little bit of a risk in terms of whether this whole narrative I'm spinning about how he's now back from his Achilles, if that's actually true or if he's going to struggle. But I liked what we saw in those final 6 games, and I'm pretty optimistic.
Yeah, the runway is definitely there, and you're making me feel better about him. We're certainly going to, slide some more work his way after hearing you talk about that. Behind him, you've got Zach Evans, rookie, and then you've got Kieran Williams, who we were a little bit hyped on last year and it just didn't really happen for him. Any of these guys intrigue you as late round picks?
I think the addition of Sony Michel muddies it up a little. I was pretty interested in Zach Evans, who's a pretty good athlete. Kyron Williams, not a great athlete necessarily. Looks like more, to me, looks more like a capped passing down only back. And I just explained some of the concerns about the target rate in this offense. So I haven't really been in on him. I don't really see the upside path for him because I don't think he's a high upside runner, like on the rushing side. I think Evans has that type of potential, but kind of feels like Sony Michel, they brought him back in, is going to be the main backup, or Evans has now got a tougher sled to be the clear handcuff. So at this moment, I'm kind of laying off a bad offense, ambiguous handcuff situation.
Let's go to wide receiver, where Cooper Kupp is really interesting to talk about at the top of drafts. The bull case for Kupp is basically if him and Stafford make it through the season healthy, the team just doesn't self-destruct. There's almost no way he's not a top 5 fantasy asset with how he's targeted. That's simple. Systemically, I do have some worries about the team, self-destructing, and Kupp starting to get a little bit old. Like, he's not old, but he's starting to get up there a little bit. Stafford's, up there. But yeah, so when you look at it and you try to apply that actually to drafts, I think it's pretty easy at the very top of the draft for me to go like, okay, Jefferson and Chase are clear. I feel pretty good about Tyreek ahead of Kupp just because, there's a little bit more risk in terms of if you knew for sure both of them would play the full season healthy, like you'd probably slide that to Kupp. But, I like the range of outcomes on Tyreek a little bit better, in part just because I think the downside is less for Tyreek. And then, CMC's in there, but I don't know. It's just tricky. I know some people have been taking Kupp as high as like 3rd or 4th overall, for not wanting to take a wide receiver that early and having Kupp over Tyreek Hill. I've sort of at this point slotted him in 5th. I was lower on him to start the offseason, have moved him up a bit, but it's a tough one. Yeah, I feel like I could feel really stupid here, in either direction.
Yeah, I think you did a good job of laying out some of the risks. I think the ceiling is really interesting as well from the perspective of last year. He was basically, a little bit less efficient, but basically on the same target trajectory as 2021. 2021 he had 191 targets, 11.1 per game. That 11.1 includes, I think, the playoffs, but he was I think better in the playoffs. I know in fantasy scoring he was better in the playoffs than he was in the season. It was basically the greatest wide receiver season ever. He goes 21 games, scores 22 touchdowns, has just a ridiculous degree of production. Last year, after that 11.1 targets per game in 2021, he was at 10.9 when he went down. It's kind of hard not to you could make a case to project him for close to 200 targets again, because there's not really anyone else in this passing game that threatens that. And what we've seen from him when healthy early last year and the whole year prior into the playoffs, into the Super Bowl, is that teams can't stop him even if he's the only show in town. Like, he's just that good, or however he fits in their offense, or however McVay's scheming it up. This isn't a guy that defenses can take away on a weekly basis. We saw similar with Michael Thomas. I do think defenses are at times okay, fine, we'll give you the short passes, the consistency of targets week in and week out is what I mean with the Michael Thomas comp. We haven't really seen that with the, outside vertical receivers where you can roll a safety over the top and it's easier to kind of try to shut down an elite Justin Jefferson, even though he's incredibly difficult to shut down as well, obviously. But I mean, it is really hard to do this projection. You were talking about how there's some systemic risk. I think there absolutely is. The other side of this coin for Kupp and for Stafford is both of these guys, another good year, a couple more good years, their personal legacies could be cemented in a Hall of Fame type candidacy. Kupp is probably 1 or 2 more good receiver seasons away from being a Hall of Fame wide receiver. He just, like I said, had one of the greatest wide receiver seasons ever. Doesn't take a ton more in your career beyond that. Stafford has a long career, a lot of counting stats. Now is a Super Bowl champion after the last couple of years, but probably needs a few more years of good stats. I kind of feel like these guys might go out into the sunset together a little bit, just putting up numbers or trying to. And so it's tricky. You look at Kupp's per game numbers, you're like, he could break fantasy football again if he can do that for 17 games.
Yeah. And I think, the dynamic that I had early on was, listen, all these guys in the first 6 to 7 picks are awesome picks. Like, let me just not take on the systemic risk. What you're pointing to, that's a missing element of like oversimplifying that argument, is Cup's ceiling is so good that he could actually like meaningfully outscore these guys, which, you know, makes it harder to just say, oh, well, I'll just fade him and take the guys that I feel more comfortable with. So that's, you know, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's an important part of it. And I still don't really know how I feel about it, but it makes the decision.
I don't know how I feel about it either. I was like, you made the concern case, I'll make the bull case, but I don't know how I feel about it either.
Van Jefferson, one of your lifelong favorite players, who we always give Ben crap because he's had this anti-Van Jefferson stance from a fantasy perspective, and then he just turns out to be like a really cool guy, and we're like, Ben, why do you hate this guy? When he
seems like an awesome human being.
He really does. And then he's, you know, pretty fantasy relevant this year because, again, this team doesn't have a lot of resources, which means they're just not adding much. And Van Jefferson seems like the number 2. Early in the offseason, I was like drafting a lot of Van Jefferson, to the point where like sometimes I wasn't drafting him when he was highest in our ranks because like I thought we were missing something. And I hate when that happens and I like kind of hold back. And then, you know, a month later, now his ADP is at a point where I don't really want to draft him, where I think, you know, the market was sort of just missing how thin this wide receiver corpse is. And now they've kind of gone the other way, where they're maybe attributing too much volume to him. We've got him each with 67 targets exactly. Thoughts on Van Jefferson and the wide receivers behind him? Like, who are you drafting late here between Tutu Atwell, Puka? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, it's and I mean, there's obvious contingent upside too with everything I just said about Kupp. Even with my really high target projection, if Kupp misses time again this year, like somebody has to get the ball thrown to them. My notes on Jefferson, like, he seems to have a path. I'm certainly a little bit more open to him, but I mean, last year, Kupp got shut down. Robinson got shut down a week later. Skoranek had been running a ton of routes and eventually got shut down himself. At the end of the year, it was just Jefferson and Tutu Atwell getting his first routes of his career, basically. And Jefferson posts his lowest targets per out run of his career. He's been pretty efficient in terms of like yards per target, actually. He's had kind of a high ADOT that's helped with that. But, I mean, really poor yards per out run so far through his 3-year career. He just looks like a guy that you're betting on routes, right? And that can get there sometimes, but I want more upside, essentially. And so I think Stafford's a really good value in best ball, but I usually don't take him unless I take Kupp. And really the only other guy that I like to take with him is Higbee, because I think Higbee is in the same situation he was in last year. I called Higbee's targets per out run last year one of the most like fraudulent ones. Sometimes targets per out run can get, you know, impacted by various elements. And for Higbee, it was, look, they were all really low ADOT targets. They were things that probably the Rams didn't want in their offense at all, but they didn't have any other options. They didn't have any good guys, you know, good receivers getting open downfield. Their quarterback's hurt, and they're dumping off to Higbee a ton, and he has this like pretty strong targets per out run, but again, way lower ADOT than he had prior in his career. Not great. But like, he's kind of in the same situation where, I mean, I do think his targets are going to come down a little bit, but I still feel pretty comfortable projecting him as the second target earner in this passing game. And then I'm looking at Demarcus Robinson as another guy, comes over as a veteran, coming off his best season, really, especially in terms of, you know, earning targets. He had a 20.2% targets per out run in a small sample with the Ravens last year. A veteran they brought over. Maybe they'll run him out there a little bit. I am projecting Van Jefferson for the second most targets at receiver, to be clear, but I have Robinson mixing in. I have Skoranek mixing in, and then I have Tutu Atwell mixing in. But I see him as more of a rotational guy because they kind of really only took deep shots to him. He had a really high ADOT, and he's still like, you know, only 150 pounds or whatever. He's not really an NFL size player, but I think he'll rotate in. But I kind of think if Robinson gets into the mix, you're probably, and then Nakua, as you mentioned as well, but I think he's actually kind of boxed out. Like there are, I think Skoronek's the one maybe that people forget about, but he ran a lot of routes last year. They like him. I think they're going to keep playing him a decent amount. I think all these guys are going to mix in to some degree. It will make it sort of tough if Kupp is dominating targets like I was talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, the only guy I've really taken late is I've taken Tutu round 18 just on some correlated teams where I needed wide receiver, but that's about it. You've got 100 targets for Higbee. We've got 89. He followed a similar path to Jefferson in terms of the ADP movement, where it seemed like the market was like, we're done with Tyler Higbee, and like not realizing that he has to catch a lot of passes here. And now his ADP's come up, but it hasn't come up. I'm still kind of in on Higbee. Was glad to hear you give some optimism for him because, yes, like as you said, the targets per out run come down, but the efficiency hopefully comes up a little bit too, as that
It sucks that his ADP is like right with Stafford, because even when I take Cup, if I want to go Stafford, I often find myself in a spot where I'm like, I have to pick either Higbee or Stafford, and I'm not going to be able to get the other one.
Yeah, that can be difficult. I don't think there's too much to add to that, though. Basically, like Higbee seems like he's fine where he is. I think some people have had a bad DFS experience with Higbee, and that affects how they feel about him in season long. So let's go to Arizona. Final team for us on the Projections Podcast special. And
the worst.
Another difficult one because the Kyler injury, the coaching change, a lot of uncertainty. We're leaning into Vegas a bit here where they're expecting Arizona to be quite bad. As a result, we only have them for 60.5 plays run overall, which is really quite low and drastically different from what they've been in the past, where they've been up tempo with Cliff Kingsbury. You've also brought them down a ton, not as much as us, where we went pretty hard on it. You've got them down to 62.3. We do each have them around a 61.5% to 62% called pass rate. You've got a few more attempts in terms of pass attempts and rush attempts just from the higher plays per game number.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm laughing because we're actually pretty similar. Like, this is a pretty huge diversion from their past trends, like you said. And then you're also layering in, okay, well, they probably have two different quarterbacks. When Kyler's healthy, do they keep letting him play up tempo shotgun, or is it a whole different offense with a new coach and everything? I mean, and then also, can they really be as bad as the market thinks? Because we've referenced the implied seasonal totals that Jack Miller has pulled together. And I mean, they're 24 points below the Bucks, which is the next lowest team. I mean, we're finishing on the last team of all the projected point scoring this year. But like, are they really that bad? I guess I've had a hard time understanding why they're projected to be so horrible.
Yeah. It is surprising to see them projected so poorly. And I think part of it, I wonder what element there is to this is a team that is in some ways tanking, right? Like they could have the top 2 picks in the draft next year, including their own pick. And Kyler, like, are they just going to really take their time allowing Kyler to come back from injury? How much do they play him when he does come back from injury? Like, is he their QB? I personally think, and, talking with Levitan on this, the way most of these teams operate is like when the guys are healthy, they kind of play, whether they should or not, most of these NFL teams aren't thinking quite at that level. So I don't think that's like a huge risk, but I have seen that floated that people are worried that they're really going to take their time with Kyler and it could just not materialize in any sort of productive way if this season starts off bad and they kind of just want those.
That's where I feel like it's the only explanation for what the market is listing. But I'm with you guys where, I think Kyler also was under fire a lot last year, is probably itching to get back, was seen yelling at Cliff Kingsbury, caught on tape, kind of chewing out Kingsbury. There were some issues there. I think he's probably excited to get back and like prove something. There's a lot of people sort of doubting him this year. And there's been a lot since he signed the contract last summer and all the video game stuff. And it doesn't seem like from an individual standpoint, he seemed to take some of that stuff personally last year in some of the press conferences. It would surprise me if he was like cool with just not playing football all year this year.
Yeah. And Kyler's someone who, when drafts first started, I took a decent bit of, and then we kind of got scared on his timeline that maybe we were being too optimistic. And then he's been kind of buried in our ranks, but I sort of treated him as like just a really, team construction specific bet where, if I've missed out on my stacks and my correlation, it's going to be 3 quarterback team where I need upside. I don't mind taking Kyler somewhere near ADP. I also have a lot of Rondale Moore, despite all the negative stuff I have on the Arizona passing game. And that makes it kind of like a backdoor stack. You can also take one of the tight ends, including Trey McBride, super late. So I've liked him as an out where, especially, where I've just missed out on other guys. I was like, I have no upside at quarterback. Like, give me Kyler and then like two guys who can just get me through the first half of the season. So
I did that a
really
ton early, and then I wondered if it was sort of a fool's gold. Like,
it might be. I don't know.
Because he's coming back from an ACL. Does he run less too? And then does he even have a real ceiling with this like really poor market perception of this team? Does he come back and just not actually have that ceiling from quarterback scoring? And then he also has obviously significant games played risk. So I stopped taking him based on that. But I mean, it's certainly possible if he comes back earlier in the year than people are expecting. And I think some people have hinted that like it hasn't like been ruled out that he could come back in the first month even, And if he did, I mean, I don't think they're going to do that, but they got a new coach. Like maybe they just are crazy and they're like, hey, we want to actually try to win this year.
Yeah. And for me, it's like an option C type thing, right? Like I don't want him. That's why he's kind of buried in our ranks. But there comes a point in a draft where I throw in the ranks out the window and I'm like, okay, I can tell myself a story to make this work with Kyler. Kind of because I'm grasping at straws, and he's one of the last outs you have to maybe some sort of upside and correlation there late. But let's go to James Conner at running back, who, if there's a poster child each year for the projectable fragile volume, it might be James Conner this year, where he steps into a team that's really bad. He's had his durability issues, talent question marks at this point in his career, but there's just not much at running back. They've got Keontae Ingram, Corey Clement behind him. And, one of these guys, and this is just a good note for myself. I think these guys who are kind of gross, but have a lot of projectable volume seem to be underdrafted when these best ball drafts first release. And then it corrects kind of quickly. So I wish I grabbed more of him early when he was like, a 10th, 11th round pick. And it was just worth the risk. Now he's come up to 86 overall, which is like the 8th round. So it's a different argument to be had for Conner. How do you feel about him and his ability to kind of hold on to this volume over the course of the season?
I think you put it really well. I mean, he's in line for a lot of work. I think his efficiency, the TD rates are all big questions. He's had strong TD rates in the past, but I've talked on some of the other shows about using those market projected implied points to come up with an expected TD number. When I did the initial projection for these guys, my TD number was quite a bit higher than their league low expected TD number. And I had to come back, and Conner was one of the big ones I had to really move down, where I still had him having, pretty strong TD rates, which he's done in the past. But the way that the market is projecting this offense, I mean, you have to have him as like a below average TD rate. I wind up with a 200 carry season where I only have him for 5.2 rush TDs and then 1.5 receiving, 6.7 TD season. Maybe he gets to 7, maybe he gets to 8. But, in the past, he's had the ability to get to 12 touchdowns or something like that. Probably not going to get there unless they really overperform the market, which is where, I mean, if you're going to make a pretty big bet on the Cardinals, I think it makes some sense. But otherwise, I think there's some real ceiling concerns with him, and even some concerns of them being so out of it that they sort of sit him down with a small nick, which, teams do when they say, hey, we want to see what we have in Keontae Ingram or some of these other young guys. I think you're taking on a lot of risk with the workload for not really a lot of upside. Mm-hmm. However, I mean, this is vaguely the profile of like Josh Jacobs last year. I'm vaguely open to, considering it, but it's tricky. It's not one that a bet that I want to make a lot of.
Yeah, I think the small difference for me between him and Jacobs last year, though, is like sort of the team expectation in general. Like the Raiders had kind of like set up as a decent scoring expected offense last year, whereas we've hit on, at least from a Vegas perspective, like those expectations do not exist for Arizona. As far as Keontae Ingram, do you think he's the clear number 2 here? Like I can see an argument for him being like a late round guy to pick, but I'd want to be pretty sure he's the RB2, and I haven't had that level of confidence yet to draft him.
I think you put that well too. I mean, again, team expectation low, and I haven't had enough confidence that he's the handcuff when I also think there's a limit to how great he can be. Now, it's a subtle difference, but I do think as far as handcuffs go, he has probably a little bit more potential to get into the lead role just through like Connor sort of being shuffled out or being too old or not being the right fit for a team that's in transition or whatever. And so Ingram winds up getting just more work like immediately. And so, yeah, maybe there's not as much ceiling, but there's a little bit more of a potential for him to hit that ceiling, whatever his ceiling is. He's been interesting to me. I've certainly given him consideration late, but the way you put it is right for me, is that I haven't had enough confidence yet that he's a clear number 2. But if we get more clarity on that, I think he's a guy I'll mix in, last round flyer.
Okay, let's go to wide receiver here. Marquise Brown, he's a good example of real early in the offseason. People are afraid of the news uncertainty. It seemed pretty clear DeAndre Hopkins was like very likely to be gone, and it wasn't priced in enough to Marquise Brown's rank. Now it's priced in fully. Difficult to know what to do with Marquise Brown. I am in general in on these Arizona receivers because our inputs are so conservative on the Arizona offense in general. A lot of stuff Ben's talking about in terms of Vegas, that like if they're still popping for me after that, like maybe it's an okay bet. And then if they beat their Vegas expectation, it looks good. But we do also know a lot of these breakout players who really beat their ADP by a lot are generally on good offenses. And like the chance of this being a good offense doesn't seem high. So it's tough. You've got 133 targets for Marquise Brown. I've got 124. For me, that sort of just kind of plays at the 5-6 turn, even in a bad offense.
Yeah, I mean, he's always had a pretty intriguing like per route run profile. The peripherals, targets per route run, not amazing, but he's been on lower volume offense in Baltimore. I was intrigued last year, and then he has kind of an injury plagued season, but still earns volume pretty well. Just wasn't real efficient, and we wouldn't expect big efficiency this year because he's either playing with a potentially not 100% Kyler or a worse quarterback. But I do think that he can, in this passing game with DeAndre Hopkins not in the mix now, earn a good chunk of the targets. I have him at 23% target share. I think he can be the number 1 in this offense. It's not super exciting, but he's also, I think a player that can add some of his own efficiency, use his speed to get some big plays downfield or some after the catch stuff. I'm at least intrigued from a volume perspective. I have a lot of Rondale Moore too, and I like the profile a lot, but he's the only other guy that I can really comfortably project for a lot of volume in this passing game. And I think there's reason to have concern about whether he can do that. And if he can't, I mean, Brown isn't going to, who's he competing with? Greg Dortch and Zach Ertz at that point. Like, it's not, he could be the only show in town like Brandon Cooks was for a couple of years with the Texans over the last few years.
Yeah, and I'm looking up my Rondale Moore exposure as you speak because I have 25% Rondale Moore thus far. I got a lot of Rondale Moore, so part of that's projectable volume, but I still think there's like an inch of upside to him, not a ton of competition, and I need you to make me feel good about my Rondale Moore exposure.
I think it's a bet I still want to make, honestly. He was really productive, really young in college. I understand there's concerns about his size. I'm a lot more comfortable playing into a short receiver when he can squat like 600 pounds or whatever he was doing at Purdue. He's like a really built athlete, 4.3 speed. Again, yeah, very short, 5'7" or whatever. Huge vert. He has other athleticism. The comps to guys like Steve Smith, I know that there's not a lot of guys like Steve Smith that have done it, but if you're going to be the next Steve Smith, you have to be not just 5'7", you got to be 5'7" and Rondale Moore athleticism is sort of the idea that I'm trying to make there. But hasn't done a ton yet. Hasn't done a lot in terms of, his ADOT was still very low last year. And I think it moved up from his rookie year was basically, I think 1.2 was his ADOT. It was basically all just around the line of scrimmage. He got a few more downfield looks last year. It wasn't, a smashing success or anything in year 2, but still like a strong rate of volume per route. And some of that is that they are kind of designing stuff for him. But again, in this offense, there's not a lot else there. I think they will continue. I mean, it's a different offense. It's a different coach. Maybe they won't see it the same way. But given his skill set, I think they'll probably still be like, okay, we want to get some design touches into Rondale Moore's hand around the line of scrimmage. The upside is sort of a Debo Samuel light profile where he gets a lot of work. He's able to add explosive yak potential on top of it. There's no reason to believe he's as good as Debo at yak, but he could be good. He has athleticism. There's a reason to believe that he could be all right, and then add some downfield stuff to it. Although obviously his height might be a limitation to being a heavy downfield receiver. But overall, I think if he's getting a lot of the short area stuff, he can get to 100 targets and he can have a high catch rate and he can have, a solid PPR line or, even half PPR. Those catches still add up. And then hopefully he's explosive enough to add some yardage efficiency on that as well. But it's a bet I'm willing to make again this year. I'm not out on him.
Any interest in Dortch or Michael Wilson as a round 18 wide receiver?
I've been a little bit more interested in Dortch again, because if Moore isn't it, last year when Moore was banged up, like Dortch was doing pretty well. And I think Dortch had a pretty interesting prospect profile when you go way back. But what he did last year is what I'm more concerned with, which seemed to show still an ability to earn volume, at least on a weekly level. Is probably a pretty good wide receiver as far as, depth receivers go in the NFL. So he's one that if things break a certain way, if the tight ends aren't doing much, if Rondale Moore's not doing much, like there's paths in this season to Greg Dortch being sort of the second weapon behind Marquise Brown, I think.
Tight end, we've got Zach Ertz versus Trey McBride. And Ertz is coming off ACL, MCL surgery. I think he suffered his injury after week 10 or right around week 10 last season. So uncertain exactly on the timeline here. As people who had Trey McBride in our high stakes season long contest, Gretch, I know we were like crazy excited to have him for the last third of the season where, Ertz was getting the volume and doing absolutely nothing with it. And we're like, oh man, now we get that volume to Trey McBride. We'll get a little bit of efficiency. And then he kind of just put up Zach Ertzian lines on less targets. So it was a little bit frustrating. How do you feel about these two this season?
Yeah, you said that well. I'm kind of playing my projection that has like Ertz sort of fading and McBride moving ahead, but there's no way around McBride being a bit disappointing from like a Tucker per outrun perspective last year, especially because Ertz was getting volume. I remember I was so annoyed during the regular season where I was like, he's not doing anything but running 5 yards and turning around. He's like not capable of running another route besides like a 5-yard stop. And they're throwing to him every play. Ertz was getting a ton of
targets too.
Yeah,
he was like a valuable in my expected fantasy points, which isn't perfect, but he was like high up there.
Which is why we were so excited about McBride taking over. And then McBride, who's supposed to be able to get those targets and then add to this with some athleticism, can't even get those targets. Obviously they're not the exact same player, and there's veteran savvy, find the hole in the zone stuff that Ertz was probably doing. But McBride, good enough profile that we expected him to come in and get some of that. And he got basically none of it. His targets per out run were incredibly low. I think it was close to 10%. 12.3%. Yards per out run, 0.84. That's just not good. I'm still interested in him from a longer view perspective. We don't necessarily want to write off tight ends just because they have a tough rookie season, but for me, it's always, context dependent. When a player has an opportunity and the things align for him and the role was working for the tight end before him and he's not able to take advantage, I take that as a kind of a negative hit, even though I like the player. I have taken some McBride late. He's the one that I'm willing to mix in a little bit of these two tight ends. But we've also talked on the other shows that there's a lot of interesting late round tight ends. And I think I've only taken him twice. I'm not taking a lot of him.
Yeah, he is one of the backdoor stack candidates if you do build a Kyler team, or if you just want somebody coming back on a Philly team. I am just drafting a lot of 3 tight end teams in general because of there are a lot of options around 8. If you get sniped on someone Trey McBride's there, it's not the worst thing in the world, even if he's not option A there. So building a lot of 3 tight end teams. But yeah, that's going to do it for us on this year's version of the Establish the Edge off-seasons projection special. Again, thanks to Ben for doing this with me. Thanks to Jack and Mark for all the help on the Establish the Run projections. Pumped that we got this out there early this year. I was saying to Ben before the show, I think we're wrapping up a couple days prior to when we actually started last year. So hopefully everyone can kind of use these and reference these throughout the off season. And Ben, tell the people where they can find you for the rest of the off season and in the actual season.
Yeah, the newsletter is bengretch.substack.com. That's where I write the Stealing Signals newsletter in season. That's my main spot. Have some sports betting thing at Stealing Lines. It's called another Substack. And then some podcasts with Sean Siegel over on Rotoviz Radio, Stealing Bananas, and the Ship Chasing Show with Pete Overzet and Pat Crane, which is always a blast. So those are the spots to find me. And I just want to say again, thanks to everyone who tuned in for this whole thing. It's been a blast doing it with you. Thanks for having me, Mike. I think you're the best in the business of this stuff, and I have such a fun time getting to talk through all of this with you and get your thoughts on it as well. Really helps me cement my thoughts and then the listeners that seem to really enjoy it. I mean, it's cool. It's cool what this has become the last 3 years, and we've had a blast doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know it makes our rankings, our projections better over at Establish the Run, being able to get your thoughts on some of these situations. A lot of times I'm like tweaking little things as we're talking like directly into our projections. So really appreciate it. Look forward to it every year. And again, thanks everybody for tuning in. You can find my stuff over at Establish the Run. If you want to watch these visually, you can check out the Establish the Run YouTube channel. Good luck this season, everybody.